Hey, everybody, welcome back. This is Jason, your host and creator of Historians of the Movies podcast. I've got a really cool, awesome conversation for you. I invited back my great friend, Lindsay Chervinsky, today to talk about The American President, which is one of her absolute favorite films. And if you know Lindsay, she's actually on our podcast earlier with our mutual friend, Megan Kate Nelson, when we did Lincoln. And she come back today to talk about The American President, her research. If you know anything about Lindsay, she is the author of the award-winning book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. She's the co-editor of Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture. And she's also the author of the forthcoming book, Making the Presidency, John Adams, The Precedents That Forged the Republic. Today's conversation, we get into this movie. We get into the idea, the revolutionary idea of the presidency and how the presidency has changed over time. We talk a lot about presidential relationships and scandals. We talk about presidential cabinets. And of course, we talk about the West Wing, because you can't talk about the American president without talking about the West Wing. And ultimately, we get into the big question of the night is President Andrew Shepard and Sidney Ellen Wade still together? So listen in. I hope you enjoy this, because this podcast will last for more than one term. Sit back and relax, because The American President is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Welcome back, Lindsay Chervinsky. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me back.
It's so weird. I already know that you're good because we've been talking for like 20 minutes already. And we're like, oh, let's start recording so people think that we just started our conversation. There's a certain level of
we're warming up.
Weirdness.
We're doing our vocal practice, like the practice scales that you do. So we're doing our warm-ups.
We had to do like comparative dog status updates, because you've got Q, who's amazing and wonderful, and I always enjoy seeing him. And then I've got the bane of my existence over here, Buster. So now we're good. You ready to talk about something we both love?
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's, dog updates are essential to begin with, but maybe not everyone wants to hear them first. So
I don't care. If you don't like dogs, you can not be on this podcast. You can scram. In fact, we should.
I agree.
We need to do Lady and the Tramp.
That's so fun.
It's a class movie, right?
Yes, very much so.
Class. Like Disney in its like 1960s, like I would totally. We should do Lady and the Tramp.
Golden Age Disney, yeah, definitely.
You know what we're doing on the Sunday night thing in 2024 for Earth Day? We're going to do an environmental history film. We're going to do Fox and the Hound.
I love that. Okay, so not to keep talking about dogs, but my parents have a mutt that literally looks like a red fox. Like, I'm not even kidding you. It looks exactly like a red fox. And so I have taken my hound to see my parents' dog and have a picture of them together. And it's a real life fox and the hound. I'm going to have to send it to you.
You have to send me this picture.
It's
Please
amazing.
Okay. Also, where are the dogs? You know what you're saying this? Where are the dogs in The American President?
That is a real, you gotta just, yes, we're talking about The American President. That is the subject of today's episode.
For those of you who read the title, yes.
That is the one part of this movie that fails spectacularly when it comes to capturing the White House. You have to have dogs.
Are you well versed in like presidential pets? Is that a thing that's come up?
I am. It was one of my portfolios when I was at the White House Historical Association. Because that's part of the history of the White House. And so I am actually fairly well versed on presidential pets.
Where's the tradition of pets come in for where's like the presidential dog or cat or horse or whatever?
Yeah. So it kind of starts naturally, because if you think about the realities of 18th century life, they would have always had horses around, and they usually had cats for very practical reasons in terms of keeping down rodents. If anyone has been to Monticello, on the upper floors, there are holes in some of the doors, and they're for cats to go in and out of to make sure the rodent population stays low. So there would have always been cats. And then, of course, Washington was a huge fan of dogs. Hounds in particular. And so he didn't usually keep his hounds in Philadelphia because they tended to be back at Mount Vernon. But pets, animals would have been around. And then the concept of thinking about them as pets started to shift. But, like Jefferson had his pet mockingbird at the White House that he had trained to sing songs. And people said that it would like perch on his shoulder and take treats from his lips, which I do that with my dog. I'm not sure if I would do that with a mockingbird, but to each their own, that's fine. And I think you just kind of develop from there. Typically, we start to see the rise of pets, especially when there are children in the White House. So some of the best pet stories are really some of the best stories, period, are when Theodore Roosevelt is around, but it extends to pets because his children had a distinct knack for getting in trouble. And so they would like sneak pets into the residence that had no business being in the residence, like ponies and goats. And I mean, just like things, they had a one-legged macaw. They had every type of dog imaginable. I mean, like you name it, they had it. So there is a lot to discuss in the presidential pet realm, but it had just occurred to me that for all that I love about Sorkin, that is a major black mark against him.
Yeah, right. And this is, I'm just now thinking about like TR with like some really high-waisted pants and his like hands on his sides complaining about the animals in the house or something like that. This is also, by the way, not how I had expected this podcast to start. I took notes for you, Lindsay. I was like, Lindsay's coming on. She's written books about things. She's my friend. I don't want to embarrass myself. Last time we did a podcast, we ranked the hottest presidents, and I'm like, okay, we're raising the bar this time by talking about the hottest cabinets.
First, we got to talk about, the smoke shows in the 19th century. And then this episode, we'll talk about pets. So I can always be relied upon for a presidential curveball.
Thank you. Like traditionally, we really start going straight and then very right off course. But this time we're just like, fuck it, let's just go. Okay, let's talk about the American president. You had told me since like before. Oh, I remember. Like a year before we started the podcast, I came to you. I was like, hey, do you want to do the American president? You were like, yes. And then I made you wait like 2 years. So welcome.
Yes. Well, what happened was I think we actually did this movie with the traditional HGAM, and I participated in that. And then you had told me about the podcast, and I was like, obviously I want to do this movie, but then we decided to do an episode with the fabulous Megan Kate Nelson. And so I had suggested Lincoln so we could have an overlap of some of our scholarly interests. So thank you for letting me circle back and do this movie.
No, absolutely. And next time we have Megan back on, we're just going to choose something that she is wildly unqualified for just to throw stuff at her. Like, Megan, Battlestar Galactica, what do you think? Megan's so cool. She probably knows most pop culture things anyway. So
she's very excellently connected in terms of pop culture. But also I think the things out of left field might be the most generative in terms of interesting conversations. So we should definitely do that.
Can I tell you, when people ask me about her, I'm like, you know what? She's the person in high school who wore the black leather jacket that was way too cool for you, but would have been friends with you if you just asked her to be. That's Megan.
And she still wears a kick. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear. So we'll say a kick butt leather jacket.
Dude, yes, you can absolutely swear. Yeah, a kick ass. I mean, you swear as much as you want.
Okay. She still wears a kick ass leather jacket.
I was a guest on a pod the other day, and I just started dropping F-bombs left and right because I pretended it was my pod. And I was like, oh, this is civilized society.
Yeah, I try hard not to do that unless I'm given permission, because naturally I actually have quite a sailor's mouth if left to my own devices. But try not to in professional scenarios unless I'm with people who either know me well or have given me permission.
Yeah, because it might take somebody apart. Because there is a part as a scholar where you're trying to present yourself in a way, unless whatever. So I get it, right? In this regard, full broadside, just let go. With the 16-inch guns, whatever. So all right, American President, you love this movie. Why? Why do you love this movie so much?
I love this movie because there are elements of it that do feel quite accessible, that do feel quite real, that feel quite relevant. And then so that's like sort of Planet A. And then Planet B is a reminder of like what we could have if we were capable of handling nice things. And how we could have a president who is incredibly eloquent, and we could have politicians who speak for higher principles and are well-read and literate and care about amazing things. And I think part of it is, as I was saying to you before we actually pressed record, that I am absolutely of the West Wing generation. And so I love the idea of having this incredible discourse and that people care about making a difference and want to do the right thing and are persuaded by that and can change their minds and can be better people. And I guess, politics is a daily reminder that television is not reality, but I still like to believe that it's possible.
It's a very hopeful film, and I keep thinking about how rooted in 1995. This is a Clinton presidency film. I'm thinking as we're talking now about when Clinton wins the presidency, they're playing "Don't Stop," thinking about tomorrow in the celebration speech. Yeah, exactly. It was it felt like a different time and era. One of the things I want to get in with you a little bit later on is maybe what happens if this film is created in 2023 instead of 1995, many years later. How is this film a reflection of the ideals of the era and things like that? But before we jump into this, you have a very particularly keen understanding of presidencies. You've written about them quite a bit. You've been on the pod before, but if someone's coming to this pod for the very first time, can you talk a little bit about maybe your books that you've written about and kind of what you're working on, and maybe how this film is really right in your wheelhouse?
Yes, it is squarely in my wheelhouse. I write about the presidency. I have been fascinated and motivated by trying to understand power and what people do with it. So that's sort of my motivating principle. And for better or for worse, the president is the most powerful person in the world and has been for off and on for quite some time, and certainly has been the most powerful position in the United States since its creation. So my first book is The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. It was the first book to look at the creation of the cabinet and what Washington did with it in his administration. There, of course, had been tons of books on people in Washington's administration and lots of books on 20th century cabinets. But I think because every president has had a cabinet and because the people that ended up being in the institution were in place from the beginning, everyone just assumed that it had kind of been there from the beginning, or that someone else had already written about it because it happened so long ago. So that was my first book, and I became really convinced that cabinets are really one of the best ways to understand presidencies because they reveal a president's strengths and weaknesses, the high points of their presidency, the low points, goals, ambitions, all of that. They're a really interesting lens to look at an administration. I then co-edited a book with Matthew Costello called Mourning the Presidents: Loss and Legacy in American Culture. And that looks at the funerals and deaths and sort of rituals and customs in American culture from George Washington to George H.W. Bush, but then critically also what those practices and what people's response to the president's deaths say about culture and American society at that time and how their legacies have shifted since they died. So it's really much more of a cultural story than one just about funeral practices. And then my second individually authored book will be coming out next summer, August 2024. And that's called Making the Presidency: John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. I will not be going in order. There will not be a Jefferson book afterwards. But this book really looks at, if Washington created so much of the presidency, what happens when someone who is not Washington, because he was so unique and so unparalleled in his stature, and that's not, I generally shy away from those types of statements. But in this case, he was so unique. What happens when someone else is in office? How does the office survive? How does the institution work for, quote, mere mortals? And how are the norms and customs and precedents, most importantly of which being the peaceful transfer of power, actually crafted? And that's what this story is all about.
So I'm watching this film and I'm enjoying. We rewatched it the other night. I was messaging you as I was doing so, and one of the interesting things I've really started to key in on are these things that we take for granted. Okay, the American president. One of the questions I have is, well, why don't we have more movies about American presidencies and things like that? But then I was like, wait a second, why do we have an American president to begin with? And so much of the discourse in the United States political arena is around these founding generations, these founding fathers, capital F, things like that, the revolution itself. But I want to talk about the presidency before we jump into this movie and talk about the role itself. Getting back to the American Revolution, just how revolutionary was the idea of a president? the creation of this role. What is this? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's very much both a product of what people were rebelling against and what had failed, and an attempt to create something new. So, of course, the revolution technically begins in 1775 with the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The United States officially declare independence in 1776, and the Treaty of Paris that ends the war is signed in 1783. In that time, the Articles of Confederation are crafted, in which there is a Congress that has all of the powers that are assigned to the federal government, but still relatively weak powers compared to what Congress has today. And there's a president of Congress, but it's really a figurehead. And actually, most of the what we would think of as like executive governing responsibilities are conducted by committees. Anyone who has served on a committee knows that that can go lots of different directions, depending on
for one.
yeah, depending on, the personnel involved and the personalities and their conflicting goals and ambitions. And so there was a recognition over that time that you sometimes needed to have one person calling the shots. And it doesn't mean that they're going to be all powerful or that there aren't going to be people or other institutions checking them. But especially in moments of crisis, you needed what they referred to as the energy that could be provided by one person, the person who could sort of take decisive action. And that realization became increasingly more prevalent over the course of the 1780s. And there were a series of crises that demonstrated both how completely impotent Congress was in general, but how important it was to have one person. And so when the delegates got to the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787, and they sort of threw out the old articles in a very nice little political trick and decided to craft something new, there was a discussion of what should the executive branch be. They recognized right away there had to be a separation between the legislative power and what we would think of as executive power. And there was a conversation about, like, should it be a 3-person executive? Should it be one person that has to rely on a panel? What should they do? And they basically concluded that if you separate the powers, you're going to rein in the ability of that person to get anything done, to do anything on behalf of the nation. And so there really does have to be one person. But of course, this was only 4 years after the end of the war. And so you couldn't have it be a king, because that was not going to go very well. Most of the people that had fought in the war were still alive. And most of the people who were drafting this document had participated in some form or another in either the revolutionary government or the war itself. So they were trying to find this balance of something that would be empowered and energetic and be able to govern with decisive action, but would still have restraints in place. And that was what they created. Now, the word president that we think of didn't actually really solidify as the title and the term until the summer of 1789, because they were debating what to call this person. So at the time, His Excellency was a common honorific for either former generals or governors. So that was one option. John Adams had a very lengthy option that he thought of that I think was something like His Elected Majesty and Protector of Our Liberties. That's not exactly right, but it did not roll off the tongue. Yeah, it did not roll off the tongue. And Madison was the one that had really pushed, James Madison was the one that had really pushed Mr. President. And he had Washington's tacit support for that. And so that title actually does not solidify until they're all in office, which I think is just one of a million examples about how we start with this written document in 1787, and then so much of it continues to evolve and fill out the messy bits once people are actually in place.
Has the role changed, like, over time, like as far as the president itself in these 200 and some odd years that we've had, aside from January 6th? What's the role happened? Like, what has happened with this presidency? You talk about how it's this messy bits of it filling in and so forth. Yeah. How's the presidency evolved since then?
So in some ways, it really hasn't changed at all. And this is actually, I think, a contribution of hopefully my book and a lot of other literature in the last 10, 15 years. There was a trend in the scholarship or the historiography for the many decades before then that had really talked about how weak the presidency was until the 20th century, until presidents like Wilson and FDR. But if we look at Washington, and of course Lincoln is another great example, Washington took decisive action and kind of sidelined Congress pretty intentionally in matters of foreign policy and diplomacy over domestic affairs. He asserted executive privilege for the first time. So things that we think of as being presidential responsibilities were very much in his portfolio, or he made them in his portfolio from the beginning. What I think is different is a couple of things. The presidency is much more of a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, 365 days in a year job than it used to be. So it used to be that if the president went home for several weeks or even several months, they would, of course, correspond with the department secretaries, but it wasn't, I think, the all-encompassing position that we think of today. And that's really because of the second piece, which is that the role of the federal government has grown so much compared to its responsibilities in 1789. When we think of things like, for example, in 1793, there was an outbreak of yellow fever, and there was a terrible pandemic in Philadelphia. At least 10% of the city's population perished. It was incredibly terrifying. No one knew what the cause was or how. There was no cure at the time, and people fled in fear. And there was no expectation that the federal government would do anything. It was very much considered a local or a state issue. And so, contrasting that with our recent experience with COVID-19, there was a lot of expectation that the federal government would do something. So I think just the difference in expectations, and those expectations have produced more executive departments that have more responsibility and bigger budgets and all of those things. It's just amplified it to the nth degree.
All right. Well, speaking of expectations, trying to figure out how to segue that into our case on Andrew Shepard here, our good president here. There's a certain expectation that the president is married.
Yeah.
In American history. I mean, we've only had, one bachelor president, you know this far better than I do, which is the impetus behind this entire film, The American President. This is a love story between Martin Sheen and... No, that's not it. That's... We'll get into my love for Martin Sheen a little bit. So we get into this movie about... This is a movie about presidential relationships. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the expectations behind that? Obviously, we've got so many notable presidents, but we've also, up until now, notable first ladies as well. And this is a movie with lacking a first lady, kind of in quest of a first lady, I think, in some ways. Can you talk about maybe the expectations about presidential relationships, which kind of sets the stage for this film?
Yeah, well, I think, there's especially in like the 18th and 19th century, there were, in addition to sort of the emotional reasons to have a spouse, there were tangible economic reasons to have a spouse. It made sense to have a partner if you were trying to manage a business or a plantation, because it was quite literally a division of labor. And so your spouse would be in charge of cooking or overseeing cooking and laundry and the house and food storage and things like that. And you might be out in the field monitoring enslaved or paid labor or at your place of business or whatever it was. And so there's a reason that marriage is sort of like a key or like a household organization is a key social structure in both, of course, the United States, but I think around the world. And so I think there's that sort of like, it's just what people do. And that there is that expectation. The second piece is that the first ladies have always played a very tangible role for the more what we would think of as social sides of the president, but I think that that's a little bit dismissive. It's almost like the more intangible elements of the presidency. We expect the president to be a head of state, which is helping comfort people who are mourning. Today, we expect the president to have championship sports teams come to the White House or state dinners or things like that. And we often poo-poo those as shallow, but state dinners are actually very important diplomatic functions. There's a lot of wrangling over who gets to go first in a new administration. It's very much it's often a calling card for people in foreign nations to say that they have had this invitation. And so it's something that they're looking for and they want. And so the first lady usually plays a very important role in that process. And then I think there's the third element, which there's this great line in the movie The Departed that Alec Baldwin says to Matt Damon. It's a good thing that you're getting married. It shows you have, I'm going to butcher it, but it shows you have a few dollars in your pocket. someone can stand you and your, for lack of a better phrasing, your genitalia functions. And so I think we have a certain expectation about that with the president too. Like if you're married, it means at least someone can stand you enough to sign a marriage certificate. And that's I think like a social element that we want to see in our presidents.
Andrew Shepard is a widower. In 1995, does this film change if he's divorced?
Totally. Because the whole like construct of the movie is that he has this amazing character, and the character was very much on display in his first election because he had just lost his wife, and so no one could criticize him. And so now they're finally free to criticize him because he has a girlfriend. And if he's divorced, then there's not that character argument, because whether or not, who knows who's at fault in a divorce, but it's at least something that can be levied against the person. And actually now I'm sort of racking my brain. I don't know that we've ever had a president that's been divorced. Well, the previous president, but no one I think Reagan is holding him up. Oh, you're right. Reagan had been married before.
And Nancy had as well. I believe they were both.
Yeah, they had both been married before. And, Mrs. Ford actually had been married. Betty Ford had been married.
That I did not know.
But I think divorced and not remarried would be a different scenario than like divorced and married again.
Somebody found a liking to this guy after all, right? Like,
yes, exactly. Like he has a redeeming quality.
Right. And it kind of reflects in some ways like the way that Americans, at least in 1995 when this film was coming out, are still seeing like the idea of marriage and moral virtue as like this guy is good because he lost his love of his life. He's a widower. He's a single dad. He's not tainted by divorce.
Well, and like, one of the big lines is that he is having relations with his girlfriend, and his daughter is in the White House while he's having relations. And so it's like, premarital sex. I cannot believe this is happening in the White House. No one has ever had sex out of marriage in the White House. And so there is like this very much 1990s cultural fear around these things that I think is very pervasive.
Doesn't that kind of speak to the power of like presidential nostalgia and like this like forced creation of memory where we like happily overlooked JFK's president? JFK is obviously the person I'm going to think about. You're talking about coming off with the idea of the term Mr. President, and all I could think about was Marilyn Monroe saying "Happy Birthday, Mr. President," and that's clearly where it came from.
Yeah.
But he's not the only player in the White House, right?
Oh, gosh, no. So, I mean, Warren G. Harding was so notorious that at one point his wife like came after him, and the Secret Service had to like lock him in a closet to protect him against her because she had like uncovered evidence of affairs. There was one of his former mistresses was sort of like blackmailing him when he was running for president. So yeah, he had quite the stable of mistresses. But there were a lot. I think what's different is up until Clinton, most presidents had a tacit agreement with the press that stuff was to remain private. And we know that the press knew all about JFK's antics. There was no mystery there, but they didn't report on it. And that's actually one of the themes in this movie is like, what is private and what is public? And one of my very favorite lines that I only know him as Martin Sheen. I can't even remember what his character's name is, but
I only know him as Jed Bartlett, but we'll talk about that later.
It's so true. Sometimes actually, do you ever find yourself like wanting to make a comment about like President Bartlett as though he was a real president, and then you're like, wait, no, it didn't happen. I need to remember this.
I feel like we're gonna derail this conversation into the West Wing, which we're gonna do a West Wing pod at some point in time. But people ask me like, you get this more than I do, I know, but people always ask me like, who's your favorite president? I'm like, Bartlett.
I love that.
No question, it's Jed Bartlett, obviously, but
anyway, so Martin Sheen has this line. He says, "With all due respect, sir, the American people have a funny way of deciding what on their own what is or is not their business." And that theme, I think, is one that has been a tension in the presidency from the very beginning, because the American people want to have full access and ownership of this person that they feel is theirs. And often presidents aren't totally comfortable with that.
AJ McInerney.
AJ, right. Okay, yes. He doesn't look like an AJ. He's either Martin or he's Jed. That's it.
You can see like where we go from AJ to a CJ in the West Wing. Like Sorkin likes these things. Well, again, we keep teasing this out. I don't want to derail this just yet. All right, let's talk about Sydney Ellen Wade, okay, because I know that you love her. Talk to me about her portrayal, like this role of Sydney Ellen Wade. She's a lobbyist, new to environmental lobbies, and this is 1995. Can you talk a little bit about her character, what we like about her portrayal in this film, Annette Bening?
Well, what I love about her is that she is perhaps the least realistic player in the Washington world. I don't think most lobbyists operate like this. And there's certainly...
Fall in love with the president?
No, what I mean is like she is so wonderfully like optimistic and genuine and earnest. And I mean, like she's intense. She's a total ballbuster, but she's also just like wonderfully in awe of the White House and wonderfully in awe of patriotism and the elements of, you know, representing the nation. She gives this, you know, when he asks her to the state dinner, she's like, I'm honored you've asked me to, you know, represent our nation. And he's like, it's just a state dinner. We're not doing espionage. But I love that like that earnestness, that's the part that's like lobbyists are not earnest people. Yeah, I love that about her. And I love that she's sort of unapologetically herself and knows exactly what she has to bring to the table. She has the dress that she dances with him dress at the state dinner. She has the best back of like anyone in the world.
Oh my God,
and
yes.
I am a very straight person, but she has a great back. And, you know, I wouldn't necessarily think that would be the part that would stand out, but you know, it's a great back, great shoulders. So she's just delightful. And like, I also love that she's, you know, like giddy about trying on dresses for a date. And I like that he portrays her as someone who is both intensely serious and intensely intellectual and really good at her job, but also does not take herself too seriously. And I think that that's really important.
We don't really know a lot about her background though, right? We don't know if she'd ever been married or anything. I don't seem to recall it comes up in the film, right?
No, the most background information we get is when he's doing the defense of her at the end. And he says that she like put herself through school and she's worked and she has these great degrees. And we know that she attended an anti-apartheid rally. That was when there was the flag burning. But other than that, we don't, and she's from Virginia because he sends her the Virginia ham. But other than that, we don't know a whole lot and she has a relationship with her dad. Other than that, we don't really know much.
She picked up French somewhere. And
she knows French. Yes, of course.
Knows French very well. How convenient they were speaking to at the French embassy, you know? But I was also like, during that scene, he was like, they're bored or they're drunk. I was like, they're right across the table from you.
They can probably hear you.
And they speak English.
Yeah, right? Totally. Totally.
No, getting back to what you said just a moment ago about her back, I am also a very straight person, so I will take this opportunity to just piggyback off that. It's like, oh my God, she looks gorgeous in this film.
Right? Amazing.
She is Annette Bening. And also, the thing I thought about this was how great the chemistry is between the two of them.
Oh, so good. So good.
Do you know who was originally cast in the role of Andy Shepherd?
Who?
Robert Redford.
That would have also been really good.
Was Robert Redford. But I think Michael Douglas probably works better here. I think Redford's a little bit older, so they may have had to have cast.
Yeah, I think also, I think that I think Michael Douglas also like looks a little bit more professorial, you know? Yeah. Like Robert Redford is almost too pretty.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking to the guy who finished runner-up to the handsomest man in American history, to Paul Newman. I mean, that was pretty much it. Like, almost too pretty. Come on. I mean, we just did Spy Game a couple like nights ago, and this man still made Brad Pitt look normal. So. Oh
yeah, I mean, so yeah, you gotta have some realism in the movie, and so yeah.
Yeah,
totally,
poor 100%. Michael Douglas, not handsome at all. You know, it's just like, oh my gosh. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the cabinets, because the cabinets do play a role in this, and we see this much more in the West Wing later on when they've got more than 2 hours to play with this. I want to talk to you a little bit of, your first book is largely, like you're saying, about viewing the presidency and through the lens of the cabinet. Can we talk a little bit about, you were talking about the revolutionary idea of a presidency. Is the idea of a cabinet revolutionary over time? Is this as wild of a notion? Where does the idea of a cabinet come from, and how does this change over time?
Yeah, great question. So The word officially comes actually from the British version. So the British had initially, the British king had a privy council. And then when the privy council got a little bit too big to be a functional advisory body, the king started meeting with a couple of his favorite advisors in a small room off of the privy council chambers, which was called the king's cabinet. Cabinet was often used as a word almost like we would use the word like study today, or it was like a small sort of like private closet where one would sometimes go to pray or exactly.
You're that close to having a presidential man cave.
Yes. So this group was called the King's Cabinet Council. And eventually they dropped council and just became known as the King's Cabinet. And the idea behind the King's Cabinet is like no one really knew who was in it because it kind of the participation and the members sort of shifted depending on who was in favor at any given moment. There were no notes taken, so there was no transparency. It was very secret, and there were a lot of allegations of corruption and cronyism. So when the presidency was created at the Constitutional Convention, they played around with several different concepts of advisory bodies. Sometimes they called them executive councils, sometimes they called them cabinets, advisory councils, you name it. And they rejected every single one because they felt like an institutionalized advisory body would either restrict the president too much or would lead to the sort of cronyism and corruption that they really feared, or the lack of transparency that they had seen in the British version. And they were really keen to make sure there was transparency of decision-making at the highest levels. However, once Washington was in office, he didn't actually convene a cabinet meeting for 2.5 years into his presidency. And I think it was because he was very aware of these expectations and the rejections of these proposals. He had really relied on councils of war during the revolution. And the councils were made up of officers and aides de camp, but they would also bring in people locally that knew the terrain or visiting dignitaries, whoever could sort of supplement their information. And so when Washington decided that he needed an advisory body, he basically copied and pasted all of his practices from the councils of war directly into the cabinet. What I think is revolutionary about it is, unlike a lot of other advisory bodies, and even today, the prime minister and the cabinet in the British version, you know exactly who's in the cabinet because in the British version, because it's made up of either people in the ruling party or some sort of, like cooperative power sharing arrangement. In the United States, we know who's in the cabinet because all of the department positions are Senate approved. But the president has no obligation to talk to them. He has no obligation to get their advice or to, include them in the decision-making process, really. And so the president gets to choose who their closest advisors are going to be. And sometimes it will be cabinet members, but sometimes it's also going to be family members or friends or former colleagues or people in the Senate. And so that malleability, that flexibility is actually what I think is really revolutionary. And great presidents take that flexibility and do amazing things with it. And bad presidents are completely crippled by it.
I wonder, have you seen the film 13 Days?
It's on my list of presidential movies, but I haven't actually watched all of it yet. So clearly I need to.
Well, you bring that up as far as about the presidency. Presidents really choosing who they want to take information from, right? Because they may have the cabinet and so forth. And I'm totally not just running out words right now since you're muted. But for those of you who are listening right now, don't ask. But
there was like this absurd. I'm sure all people who are in classrooms right now have this, but there was an absurd virus going around, and I was leveled by it the last couple of weeks. So I was trying to be discreet and mute my microphone while I blowed my nose, and you totally blew my cover.
We're known for discretion here.
Yeah, well, Kennedy is a great example of a president who actually I kind of say like, don't do this, because he had his actual cabinet, but then he had his kitchen cabinet in the White House. And the problem is not so much that he had a kitchen cabinet, it's that no one actually really knew who was calling the shots and who was making decisions and like who was empowered to make decisions or to have influence or have the president's ear. And that level of uncertainty doesn't usually work.
Where does the vice president figure into this whole idea of a cabinet? Because we don't see a vice president in this film, if I recall correctly.
No, and I will not force this to jump ahead, but of course the vice president, or the lack thereof of a vice president, is a very interesting plot line in The West Wing. The vice president is the most worthless office in the United States, according to John Adams. It is the worst place to put someone of energy like John Adams or Theodore Roosevelt. The first vice president, John Adams, was not invited to a single cabinet meeting. He was kept out of them. And that set the stage for the vice president really being quite distant from actual governing power and any responsibility. The first vice president to have any sort of a real relationship with the president was Walter Mondale and Jimmy Carter. But I think when we think of, like vice presidents today that really are involved and are sort of partners, the first one that I think of is Dick Cheney.
Really? Wow. It takes that long to really, for us to have a vice president with that kind of.
Yeah. I mean, like Al Gore and Bill Clinton worked together, and there are a lot of pictures of them like in the Situation Room or in classified briefings, things like that. But it is whoever you like place the start of that relationship with, it is very much a recent creation and one that was not there from the beginning.
Then let's talk about our current president, who was also a vice president recently. What was that relationship with Barack Obama and at the time, Vice President Joe Biden? Was that also a close working relationship? Were they friends? Like, what's that like?
Yeah, well, so the challenge with talking about like recent administrations is that so much of it is still classified. So there's a lot of it that we still don't know. And my guess is that there's a lot of it that will come out once some of the key players pass away. Because a lot of times, the really good stuff, the really juicy stuff doesn't come out until later. I mean, there were phenomenal memes about their bromance, which were quite delightful, especially the ones that came out after the 2016 election about them, like, playing pranks were just amazing. And it does seem like they had a productive working relationship and that Biden was able to contribute a lot of very constructive things to the partnership, especially when it came to Congress, because he had so many longstanding relationships and a lot of institutional power in the Senate. I don't think it was ever as buddy-buddy as they made it out to be. I think there was always some tension. There's been a lot of reporting about how, Biden kind of has a chip on his shoulder because he's not from Harvard and Yale and, not the Ivy elite. And I think some of Obama's staff looked down on him and his staff a little bit. And so there was some friction there. But also, like, when people report on friction between Vice President Harris and President Biden's staff now, I'm like, yes, and like, please show me an administration that has not had friction between the staff of the president and the vice president. Like, that is very much par for the course because they're competing over jurisdictions and media attention. And, like, of course there's going to be conflict. So that doesn't really bother me all that much.
Well, let's talk about some conflict in this film because ultimately, we've got to have a central hurdle to come over. And naturally, of course, it's due to the woman of the film, naturally.
She's always to blame.
Always to blame. I'm glad you also agree, all right? Lindsay Chervinsky on the record, women are to blame.
That's going to get me in a lot of trouble.
So much. Fletcher
it reminds me. It reminds me of My Fair Lady at the end, where he's like, "Where are my slippers?" It's just like, the constant female existence. Where did you put my slippers?
Oh my gosh, yes. We have a presidential scandal.
Yes.
Sidney Ellen Wade burned a flag way back in the day. Here's my question.
She didn't even burn it. She was just present when it was burned.
Right. And of course, this is coming out in 95. Bill Clinton himself is about to get himself a little scandal as well. Are presidential scandals universal? Like, does every presidency have its own scandal? Do presidency? I mean, Obama had a tan suit, I recall.
All presidents have things that are, embarrassing. Sometimes they get really puffed up in the absence of anything more significant. So Obama's tan suit is a great example. President Jerry Ford, was so honest. And I think by all accounts, a really excellent man and had a really excellent marriage. His wife certainly made headlines because Betty Ford didn't particularly care for a lot of conventions. So it wasn't necessarily scandal, as she was just like, when she had breast cancer, at the time, you didn't say the word breast publicly. It was considered very inappropriate. And she was like, screw that. I have breast cancer. Here's the treatment that I'm having. You should absolutely speak to your doctor about it and go get checked. And so she probably saved like incredible lives by doing that.
Amazing. Yeah.
That's not really a scandal. At one point, he apparently like tripped over like stairs or something. And so they referred to him like they were constantly cracking jokes. The press was constantly cracking jokes about him being a klutz. And in reality, he was actually an amazing athlete, like swim every day, phenomenal athlete. So like that's really scraping the bottom of the barrel when you're like looking over someone being a klutz. So there are certainly some presidents who like don't really have scandals, but there are also some really good ones. And because it is, you know, a position of power, if you have power and women and, you know, booze and money, there's always a great opportunity for scandal in that regard.
Do scandals tell us maybe even more about the president's relationship to the press, since it's the press who's reporting these things? You know, if you say that like, every president's got skeletons in their closet, right? Teapot Dome kind of comes out. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're right. Teapot Dome comes out sort of towards the tail end of Harding's. And what's really interesting is actually, I think some of the much bigger scandals come out after that and are not really remembered as much because they're not as catchy. There was a great book that came out early this year called Crooked. And it was about a lot of the scandals that occurred in the Department of Justice that were uncovered after Harding had died, about his attorney general, I think it's Harry Doherty. And those were frankly far more nefarious than Teapot Dome. So that's an example of not necessarily press, but like certain senators banging on the news. I think like another example of that, I think it's not necessarily that they show the relationship between the president and the press, but they often shine a spotlight on what society is concerned about at the moment or what politicians are preoccupied with. So a great example of that is what's called the Petticoat Affair during Andrew Jackson's presidency, when the wives of Margaret Eaton, also known as Peggy Eaton, who was the wife of John Eaton, who was the Secretary of War under Jackson, they had apparently had sexual relations before they were married. Now they went on to get married, but this was quite inappropriate at the time. And so the other women in the cabinet, the other wives of the cabinet secretaries, refused to socialize with her and cut her socially. And Jackson was furious about this and demanded that the cabinet secretaries make their wives fall in line. And you can imagine roughly how well that went. The secretaries wisely said, we want no part in that. And so he refused to speak to his cabinet for a year. And it was the talk of the town. It was covered in the newspapers. It was absolutely the peak of Washington society gossip and entertainment. And that said a lot about both like what were the social norms at the time, but also what were the cultural divisions within the Jackson presidency. And often their divisions over this one social issue reflected a lot of other differences as well. And so I think it just tells us a lot about the moment that they happen to be living in and can reveal a whole lot of other things.
I want to talk about the West Wing. I've been wanting to talk about the West Wing for ever. We're going to talk about the West Wing next year when your book comes out. I watched this, I think it was Saturday, and I messaged you, and I'm like, I can't watch this movie without thinking about the West Wing. I mean, what do you think? I mean, do you have that problem too, watching this movie and not... The Martin Sheen thing is a real problem for me.
Yeah.
Like, that's the president.
So the thing is, I mean, first of all, the screenplays are both written by Aaron Sorkin. Mm-hmm. Aaron Sorkin is known for having people he really likes to work with and then working with them again and again. And he does this both in the theater and in movies. And so that's why you see a lot of the same players. So like, for example, Joshua Malina has a relatively small part in this movie. He's one of the staffers at the environmental agency, and he comes on as Will in The West Wing later in the show. And he's initially like one of the press writers, and then he becomes the director of communications. So like you see a lot of the same people, but there are also a lot of the same themes, like the personal life versus public life. What is secret? What is not? You see a lot of the same tropes, like the president doing unexpected visits. In this movie, it's to a flower shop. In The West Wing, it's to a bookstore. Use a president who was a former professor. I mean, like, they're just a lot of the
nerdy,
same things.
Right? And they're teasing him. He can't cook.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot there, but then there's also just a lot of this aspirational, like, politics should be something better and trying to appeal to the better angels of our nature and that, inspirational uplift. And of course, the witty repartee, which I never tire of. So if you didn't think of The West Wing, I would have thought you would have been hit over the head.
Yeah, I mean, I want to go watch 7 seasons right now and root for Josh and Donna.
I mean, I usually watch like 1 through like halfway through 5. And then I think I usually jump to like the second half of season 6. Cause there's a chunk in there that you don't really need to watch because it kind of gets off.
Well, after Sorkin leaves after 4 and then it changes a bit and they kind of find their way.
Yeah. It takes them a little while to find their way, but they do.
To be expected, right? I mean, how do you leave, how do you come back after Sorkin? And of course, they're trying to talk about new presidencies, Jimmy Smits, Alan Alda, who's also awesome. God, we're not going to ruin a podcast that hasn't taken place for like another year, have we? So,
no.
God, I have to tell you, I like shouted when Josh and Donna finally got together. I was on the couch yelling. I was like,
I distinctly remember. So, when the show first came out, this was back before streaming was a thing, when you would actually like have to watch it. And I grew up in a fairly strict household, and there were like only like during the week, there were only a couple of shows I was allowed to watch live because I had homework and other things. So very strict household. But one of the shows was The West Wing. And I distinctly remember, I think it was Thursday nights. Maybe it was Wednesday night. Either way, it was Wednesday or Thursday night. And, I distinctly remember that episode and then like going to school the next day and being like, oh my God, because it was like a cultural thing. And, it was huge.
I'm realizing now your West Wing was my ER.
Oh.
Because I'm a little bit older than you. And I didn't watch West Wing in its initial run. I didn't watch West Wing until like 2009, 2010. Oh, No, it was like 2011 before I watched The West Wing. I remember I didn't watch it till I'd moved to Kansas.
In some ways, I almost like wish that I had had that experience of being able to watch it. I watched it like when it was first on TV. And then when my husband and I started dating, he hadn't watched it. So we went through and we watched it together. And so I kind of got like the fresh experience. But there's something so epic about being able to see it all at once.
Oh, it's so good. I'm ready to like go back and watch. Someone asked me the other day what I will binge watch, and I'm like, West Wing, 22 episodes, 7 seasons. Let's go.
Yeah,
like, I don't know how they kept it going.
That pilot is in some ways like probably one of the best pilots that has ever been created.
And you don't see Martin Sheen till the very end of the show because really the show was about the cabinet or his core.
Really about the White House staff. I don't know. Did you ever listen to the West Wing Weekly podcast?
I was going to ask you because you brought up Josh Molina, and yes, in my mind, West Wing is just below Downton Abbey in my life. Okay, so yeah, it's up there. Yes, I love it.
So if I say he gave him the knife, you know what I'm talking about.
Charlie.
We're getting really deep here. Anyway, for fans of The West Wing, if you have not listened to the West Wing Weekly, it's really fun because it's Joshua Molina is one of the characters that's on it, and he's one of the co-hosts, and like they interview a lot of the actors, and you just get so much amazing stuff from like behind the scenes. One of my favorite episodes was them talking about when they filmed with Yo-Yo Ma and how like just in awe of Yo-Yo Ma they all were. And that's one of, I think, the best episodes of the entire show anyway. And so, I mean, just like it was such a great podcast. It was so fun to get all of that information. You get to kind of live it again fresh in real time.
I have to tell you 2 things. Okay, first of all, you brought up the knife. I was trying to not talk about the knife, but the knife gets me verklempt over here. I will 100% just tear up every single time.
If not, you would be dead inside. It's such a good moment.
Okay. Also, before I die, I want to live in Washington, D.C. in the wintertime because of one episode of The West Wing, Shibboleth. That's the episode. Oh, God. That's my single favorite episode. God, I love that episode. It's so good.
It's a good one.
Do you have a favorite character? We'll go back to American President. Do you have a favorite character on The West Wing?
So I am very torn. I'm torn between Toby and Josh because they speak to like different elements. I love Josh's humor. I often am known to be quoting like, bring me all the bagels in the land.
I knew you were going to say it.
Yep. So I love that about him. He's so funny. It's just, I love Bradley Whitford. I think he's just hysterical. And I don't know if I think that they partly, like, I think when Sorkin was writing this, I think he was including a lot of,
you can see Michael J. Fox's character in Josh, right? Like he's like a rough draft.
Well, it's like a mix of like that character and who like Bradley Whitford actually is, I think, and like a merging of that. But ideologically, I think that I am sometimes more, not like politically ideologically, but like sort of like the down on humanity of Toby. So I really love Toby, but I hate how they ended his part of the West Wing story. I felt like it was totally inconsistent with his personality. If he had been unhappy about something, he would have not shut up about it. He would have been raging about it. He would have been like banging down the door to the Oval Office. He would not have been quiet. And so I feel like they really did a disservice to the incredible character that Richard Schiff had built in this person.
Yeah, it's definitely that wouldn't have happened, I don't think, had Sorkin stayed on. I don't think that would have been. And like you, I start with Josh. I detour towards CJ for a little while because I love the relationship of her and Danny. I'm a softie, and I just love it. And then but ultimately it's Toby in his heart. Like the episode with the veteran the burial, the cemetery, that one. Oh God, that's everything Toby is. And it felt like they jumped the shark with the whole, we've got a spaceship and really?
No, it would have never gone down that way. It would have been much more like, early on, he and Bartlett get into like a screaming match and they have real conflict. And that's how it would have been. It would have been a screaming match. It wouldn't have been a subtle betrayal.
Of the relationship.
Yeah.
Because Toby drives Bartlett nuts.
Yes, because he's usually right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
all right.
Totally.
We've talked about our beef with the West Wing. Let's come back. Let's talk about our beef with the American Front. Oh, also, I need you to forget all the good parts of that conversation. So when we talk about the West Wing,
okay, yeah, not a problem. Well, there's 7 seasons worth. I think we'll have plenty to say.
So, all right, what's your beef with this show? With what do you have beef with the American president? What don't you like?
Well, it's because it's not a 7-series show. There's less to dislike, and I enjoy a whole lot of it. One of the issues I've always had a little bit of a problem with Sorkin's writing is that the strong characters tend to be the men and the like nice bit side players tend to be the women. So the wives that help Sydney escape in the car or the, advisor. To me, in my mind, what's her name? It's Nancy, but it's not Nancy. It's she's also in the West Wing. She's one of these players. What's her name? I will find her. Oh, okay. Robin McCall in the movie, Anna Devere Smith.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. Gotcha.
But in my mind, she's Nancy because Nancy was the national security advisor in the West Wing.
Yep. Totally.
So, but Robin Smith in the movie, she's like, she has a couple of lines here and there, but some of the, like, they're usually like the main staff and the main advisors, and CJ of course kind of breaks this mold later on, but the main staff and the main advisors are men and the secretaries are women. So, like, that's a little bit of a beef. Now, maybe that was more accurate in the 90s, to be fair. Women were still sort of relative rarities in upper senior staff in the West Wing. So that, I think, is an accurate assessment. DuPont Circle is not where you would go if you were coming back from the Capitol. It makes no sense to drive into DuPont Circle. If you're driving from the Capitol to the White House, you're going to drive down Pennsylvania Avenue. So that like logistical element, as someone who's spent time in DC, it makes no sense. There are plenty of circles that are confusing. DuPont Circle is not one of them. But these are really fairly piddly problems with the movie. Do you have beefs?
I got one beef. And I think this is an interesting thing with the way we're looking at presidencies in 1995. I messaged you about this the other day. There's a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office, right? And so much of the way presidents aren't shy about who they put portraits of in the Oval Office. I seem to remember Barack Obama was very, very deliberate in who in the portraits that he chose to have in the Oval Office, ideas of people who they model after. I think maybe it's kind of reflective, and I don't think we'd see Jackson in the Oval Office if this film were made today. because we see this, and also we see Leo McGarry in The West Wing talking about Jackson and his big hunk of cheese that he would dole out to people who would come by the White House during his presidency. I think it's an interesting way a subtle but interesting way to say that people are looking at Jackson differently in 1995 than they are in 2023. Obviously, with my own intellectual background, I do not like Andrew Jackson at all. I think he's a first-rate villain, and I hope he's burning in hell. But yeah, so it also, I get why, because the idea that Jackson styled himself as a man of the people, and obviously Andy Shepherd is also doing that. But it's Jackson.
Well, it was also, I mean, it's a very in the Democratic Party for a long time, there was the Jefferson-Jackson dinner, the JJ dinner, which was like one of the big annual dinners. And it was like a big deal to be given an opportunity to speak at that. And it was like one of the events that if you were an up and comer, you really wanted to be at. And so, Jefferson and Jackson were the two lights in the Democratic Party for a very long time. And you saw that, this is actually a fairly accurate reflection of what presidents would have done. So Lyndon Johnson, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump have all had Jackson's portrait in the White House for different reasons, I am sure, or portrait in the Oval Office. But, if we're sort of styling this on like the Clinton era, if Shepherd is supposed to be like Bill Clinton without some of the character issues, then that is a very accurate Oval. That is a very accurate Oval Office. And you're right. I mean, presidents are very intentional about who they select and who they want to have and who they choose to highlight. And it says a lot about who they admire and who they're looking to for guidance. One of the more interesting elements when Biden came in, most of the time, usually presidents had a very large portrait of Washington over the fireplace. And then sometimes they would have ones flanking. And instead of one large portrait, Biden has a bunch. He does have a portrait of Washington in there, but he has like Hamilton and Jefferson facing each other. And he has like a whole gallery. And so it is really interesting to see the choices that people make and how intentional they are about using art to showcase their values. All
right. You've written about presidents, cabinets. I'm not going to ask you who your favorite president is because that's boring. I want to know what.
I never accept the premise of that question anyway.
Right.
I always say who are the ones that I think are the most interesting and who are the ones that I think were the best, because what does favorite even mean?
It doesn't, right? So let's talk about this. Who are the most interesting? Like, who do we need to see on screen? What American president do we need to see? Do we need to better know? And this can be your favorite smoke show. This can be any, like, who do you want?
No, the ones that sometimes were often the ones that were often quite tasty were not necessarily interesting people. It doesn't necessarily correlate.
Don't be dissing on Calvin Coolidge. The least interesting
he would not be on my list. No. He would not be on my list. Well, I do think, and he actually made our list before. I do think that someone needs to probably make Destiny of the Republic into Garfield. A movie. Oh, that would be a great one. I think that a movie about John Quincy Adams would be super fascinating. You could do either like the latter part of his life, his time in Congress. You could do his time Secretary of State. I mean, there's so many different ways you could do it, but he's usually on my most interesting list because he was so smart, and he was so smart that he could get along with anyone because he just couldn't really stand people. And I find him endlessly entertaining. I think there have been some attempts to put him on film, although I don't know that it's been done super well, as Theodore Roosevelt. He's my other most interesting because he's never boring. I don't know who you would have play him. He would be one of the harder ones to cast because he had such a distinct face. He has like a very almost like round, such a square jaw. So
there was talk that Leo was going to do back when the trilogy of books came out. About the rise of Theodore Roosevelt, Theodore Rex, which I still think is the best book name ever heard, and Colonel Roosevelt. DiCaprio was supposed to do him, but DiCaprio doesn't really have the body type. But that can be. I don't see DiCaprio as our guy, and I don't know.
Well, and that's also one where, because like if you were to do like the presidency or even some of his older life adventures, you don't need to be young, which is really useful. I mean, right. DiCaprio I think could do it. He can pretty much act his way out of a bag. Yeah, that would be really interesting.
I want to see somebody, Ryan Gosling. Gosling could pull off a younger version of him.
But his face is so long and narrow. And I think with presidents, I mean, one of the real challenges with presidents is like we know what their faces are. You know, it's not like a historical character where we don't really know what they look like, or a made up character. We know what presidents look like. And so that's why I think it's often so hard to cast them.
Rest in peace, Robin Williams. He might be the closest we ever got, you know.
Yeah, he would have been so good.
You know, he actually had the dramatic chops to pull it off, though, right? I don't know that we could have seen it after, but...
I mean, like, Theodore Roosevelt had this, like, almost like this ebullience to him, you know, like his teeth. And, like, he was just... And he would have been great at that.
Well, I think we missed our shot. Yeah. Just another reason to get sad about that. All right, we have to pull this out of dumb time. We're going to talk about Robin Williams being sad. Okay, I've got a question for you here.
Okay.
This may be the big question of the night, because I've turned every episode now into a romantic comedy. Are Andy and Sydney still together? And if so, what's life like for them these days?
Oh, that's interesting. Yes. And I think you probably would have seen a Clinton-esque she would run for office after his time is done.
I think Andy dies. I think...
That's terrible. I thought you were ending on a sad note.
Well, now she can go get some. I don't know. Like, so... With that
back? Terrible.
No.
That's so depressing.
Oh, no, his journey is over. Now he can go be with his first love. I don't know. No. I definitely see they definitely stay together for the rest of their life. She runs for office at some point in time. I absolutely see her as a senator, something else. Like she's
totally
leader of the UN, something like that. She's great.
Yeah, that'd be good.
I can see that.
Totally.
All right. Our big question. Is The American President a history movie?
No, but it is a civics movie. It is an excellent way to learn about how the American system works and American values and the Constitution and the government. But it's not actually a history movie because it's not about anything that actually happened.
So you're telling me that Tommy Tuberville needs to watch this film so he can learn about the three branches?
I think he would learn a lot. I think he would learn a lot.
I guess so. All right. All right, Lindsay, we have had a blast talking about the American president. Where can people find you when you are not here talking about the love lives of fictitious presidents?
Yeah, I swear I don't usually actually spend that much time talking about this, but then I come on podcasts with you and I start talking about, rankings of their attractiveness and all of that.
Wait till we do the John Adams episode.
Yes.
Abigail Smoke Show? Yes.
Yes. Oh my God, we're gonna have so much to talk about there. So I am trying to figure out which social media app is going to survive. I'm on all of them right now. I'm trying to figure out what's going to come out on top. I think the best way, though, actually, is I have a newsletter. It comes out every month. It's called Imperfect Union. It's free. I never spam people, only one email a month. I usually include an essay and then links to other things like this excellent podcast and op-eds and then whatever else I've done in that particular month. But it's probably the best way to stay in touch and get updates and things like that.
Lizzie, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to Lindsay Chervinsky for coming in and talking with me today. Lindsay, it's always awesome to talk to you about this. I can't wait to talk to you again. Thank you, of course, to our intrepid producer, Fletcher Powell. You can find him on Twitter and elsewhere at Fletcher_Powell. Thank you, Fletcher, for being here and being the vice president. No, wait, vice presidents are useless. Chief of staff of Historians of the Movies podcast. And, of course, thank you guys for being the electorate of the HATM podcast. Thank you for being part of this movement, part of everything. This was an awesome conversation. I hope you guys really liked it. If there are podcasts and scholars you want on the podcast, please let me know. Please let me know if there are films that you want to have on this pod. Keep sharing this with your friends. Keep liking, keep reviewing, keep subscribing, leaving comments. Thank you. Keep doing what you're doing, guys. You guys are amazing. I don't want to ask anything. You do you. Guys, thank you so much. That's all for now. Ciao for now. Bye.